got to posting the guidelines, I think 2 days ago, so hopefully you guys were able to see those. I'm currently working on extending the deadline as much as I possibly can to give you guys a couple extra days to do that collage. And then I hope you also saw that the UNLV Special Collections has agreed to help you guys conduct research, and they've already set aside a lot of materials, including photographs that are only located in the special collections, and you do have to go in person to see them. They do have a scanner there, so you can just scan them onto a flash drive or email them to yourself, and that way you'll have your sources. But I would definitely recommend heading down there. It's an elite library. And like I said, they're perfectly aware of all the projects you guys are doing, and they have sources for 99% of them. All right, so today we're gonna finally get started on the strip. And what I want us to do along the way is not just see it as a number of different casinos, one after the other, but also see it as a reflection of the larger United States. Because Vegas is a resort town that is always about hospitality, they're always going to be trying to prey upon what Americans are interested in at any given time. And we'll see that with the 3 eras that we'll talk about today. When we come back on Tuesday, we'll continue a couple more eras, and then assuming our deadline is extended, I'll give you guys an extra lecture on Thursday. So before we begin, I did forget to mention last time, and I did just want to bring it up really quickly. In the historic West Side, or in Ragtown, because Clarktown didn't want them to be officially a part of Las Vegas, they completely cut them off from any water source. And so what they did was they dug wells, and the groundwater at this point was really only 5 feet underground. You really only have to dig about my height, around 5 feet, and then you find a spring of water, and you didn't really have to worry about bringing in pipes into that area of the city. Now, unfortunately, they weren't smart enough to cap these wells, and so they ran like this 24/7 for a couple of years, which really drained our groundwater, and it's part of the reason why our aquifer today isn't as full as it should be. So just keep that in the back of your mind, because we'll come back to it in a couple of slides. So last time we left off with a couple of entities that we've already explored and talked about why they came to be. I told you guys that Summerlin is something we have yet to talk about. It will be in another lecture. But today we're going to talk about the strip right here. And I want you to look at the geography of it. When we talked about urban planning, I told you that a city is not just influenced by its politics and its economy, but also the topographical features of the map. So if you think about the road to California, it should technically be a little bit more this way, but because we have mountain ranges, you do have to squeeze in through this area. And so Las Vegas Boulevard is forced to do a little bit of a turn in order to head down into California. And so now the old Spanish Trail has been fully paved, and we now have a road incoming into Las Vegas in this direction. And that's directly going to influence where the strip begins. So remember, that's Clarkstown. It does have Main Street, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and then 5th Street at the edge of town. And that's going to be where Las Vegas Boulevard runs through and then heads up to North Las Vegas. There's our train station, and remember that is Fremont right there, or Central Avenue. This is what it's going to be looking like around the time. So more or less getting to be a little bit of a larger town. Fremont Street is of course going to be the most developed cultural corridor. And then you can see that past probably where the downtown grid ends, there's really no development yet. And this is around the time that we have our first strip casino properties, just to give you an idea of how young the casinos are at the time. Now remember last time I told you Vegas has already started to play with the idea of being a resort city. Specifically, when we look at Boulder Dam, they start marketing themselves as the gateway into the Boulder Dam in order to attract tourists. And we'll see that this is a common theme throughout Vegas history, and even today. We like to rebrand ourselves to whatever the public wants to see. Anything that the public is interested in, that's what Vegas becomes. And so, in the 1940s, we start advertising ourselves as Las Vegas, Nevada, still a frontier town. And you'll recall, Vegas is from 1905, right? The era of cowboys is like the 1860s and 70s. But at this point in time, Vegas is realizing that the larger United States is very interested in this idea of the old American West, the idea of railroad towns, cowboys, all that sort of good stuff. But by this point, the frontier doesn't exist anymore because the United States has fully spread from sea to sea, and so there's really nowhere else left to explore in the western direction. The frontier is at this point a myth and a part of US history. But because World War I has just ended, there is this sort of need for escapism. People want to go back to how things used to be before the war, which is when the frontier was still more or less alive. But at this point, again, it doesn't exist, and so we do have to start creating a faux frontier. And this gives us the introduction into the first phase of the Las Vegas Strip, which we call the Western phase. And it really only lasted around 5 years to give you an idea of how quickly Las Vegas was changing. So this is a propaganda poster that was distributed around the country to bring people over to Las Vegas, where we can see we have Lake Mead. And notice the way in which the rocks are depicted. It looks very much like the Grand Canyon, but anyone that's been down there knows that this is not the natural color of our soils. We do not look like New Mexico and Arizona. But again, it says Las Vegas, Nevada is still a frontier town. And so people begin getting this idea, well, Vegas is out in the west, small railroad town, they probably have cowboy culture and saloons and all that good stuff. We should go over there. At this time period, the US is pretty conservative when it comes to gambling. It's not really seen favorably. So if you paint it with the idea that you're role-playing as part of a western town and you're going to a saloon, it doesn't look so bad. And Las Vegas picks up on those notes, and it starts creating gambling halls with names that are going to be associated to Western things, right? So you can see we have the Hotel Apache, we have the Frontier Club, the Oasis Cafe, Pioneer Club back here. So the branding on Fremont Street starts to change itself in order to fit what Americans want to see. It's no longer about Boulder Dam necessarily. And so comes along Thomas Hull. He's a prominent hotel owner throughout California, Texas, some other states, and he comes to Vegas and he realizes that there's a pretty good market here because number one, we do have a road from California, and two, it's a city that's already starting to market itself as a tourist attraction. And so he locates out here, right? We have our historic Clark Grid up here, that's historic 5th Street. And he goes all the way down here, completely outside of the town's boundaries. 2 reasons for that. First, he didn't want to pay city taxes, so he didn't locate within the city. And secondly, he did want to catch all the drivers that are coming in from California, which come through Las Vegas Boulevard, the old road from California. And so his idea and strategy is if I trap them in my casino first, they're not going to go spend their money up north. And it worked. So this is going to be on the site where the festival grounds are across from the Sahara. It's still empty today. And he called it El Rancho Vegas. Right, and you can see that the posters they have for it read very Western. Bless you. And the layout that it begins to take is reflective of the fact that this is no longer a part of the railroad town. When we looked at Fremont Street, the way the building approaches the street, it's right there, it's just a small sidewalk. It's a walkable town that is geared towards pedestrians. When you look at the Strip, you have these huge setbacks, these wide roads. It's clearly a resort made for people arriving on the car. And that's still sort of what the Strip is today. It is an automobile city of sorts. We'll see it changes a little bit at the tail end of the 90s, but in this era, it's still the era of automobile arrival. So we have this really broad expanse. This probably would not have been able to be possible if it was in the Fremont grid. But you'll notice they do have nice manicured lawns. Lawns, of course, take up a lot of water, so they are digging wells here as well, since they are not incorporated into the city. And you can see that these fresh lawns and in the pool back there, the advertisements, all of it is a huge sign to bring people that are coming up from California, let them have a nice stop here before they actually get into the old town of Las Vegas. And many times they never even made it out there because everything they needed was in here. So we get this idea of an all-inclusive resort. You have a hotel, you have a little casino back here. It's not really the selling point at the time. And of course you have a pool. And you can see they call it the Roundup Room. That's where our early gambling is going to be going on. There it is on the corner of Sahara, Las Vegas Boulevard. So this is the area that's still kind of empty. There's some Hilton towers down here today. But for the most part, you can see there isn't really much going on around it. And it's just this big patch of grass in the desert. Now, someone else realizes that this is a really great idea, and we get our first competitor on the strip, the second resort called the Last Frontier. Very appropriately named because, again, frontier doesn't exist, and so this is the last chance you get to experience the great American frontier. And I want you to notice what they've done with the pool. So rather than having it in the back, like the El Rancho did, they put the pool out in the front. So that as people are driving in from California with no AC in their car, the first thing they see is this beautiful sparkling pool of water. And so the pool itself almost acts as its early sign or billboard in order to market itself and bring in those drivers. So the Last Frontier, you can see, locates itself a little bit further south, with the idea being I'm going to get all of the visitors before they can get to El Rancho and before they can get to the actual town. And this is why the strip begins to develop from this point. The stratosphere is located all the way down to Mandalay Bay in order to capture those tourists first. This is what it looked like. The Last Frontier really pushed the idea of this Western theme much further than El Rancho ever did. The interiors were all very saloon looking. You can see they have like a Texas theme going on as well. They just mix everything that's Western. There isn't really any care for having a correct era of the Pioneer Village. They're just kind of using all the stereotypical forms of the American imagination and putting them into this casino. And eventually they developed on the Last Frontier property, the Last Frontier Village, which is a fake little Disneyland village where you can go pretend to be pioneer out in the Old West. You can see they have wagons, they have fake trains. Here you can see people getting off a very modern bus onto a stagecoach to go pretend to be pioneers. So with the Last Frontier and El Rancho, we're seeing that we have the benefits of modern technology because they are completely cooled by AC, but we also have the thematics begin to come in that characterize Las Vegas. So another scene from there. We also have a gas station in order for the drivers to refuel. And then we have the Little Church of the West. So if you did choose this building, it is originally a part of the Last Frontier's village, and it was later moved all the way down to Mandalay Bay. So technically, it is the single oldest property that is on the strip. And so the Western phase, as short as it was, just 5 years, left us with three things that the rest of Vegas is going to follow, even to this day. Number one, they start realizing that there is an appeal to having an all-inclusive resort, meaning you do not have to leave to go eat, or sleep, or gamble, or go in the pool. It's all in one location. Number two, they learned the power of thematics and, preying on the American imagination and how much they want to role play as something. And number three, the importance of having a quote-unquote sign. And I say quote-unquote sign because it wasn't technically a sign yet, but the idea of the pool out front to draw visitors in is our earliest version of it. The next phase is going to be called the Sunbelt Modern Era. This one is going to last a little longer. That date is incorrect. It's actually 58. So that era is going to last around 10 years. So getting a little longer, but still very short eras. And the Sunbelt Modern Era is called so because of the Great Migration from the Rust Belt in the north down to the south. Remember, these are the 1950s. People are coming back from war. They want to have a nice home. Suburbanization is beginning to take place. And so we see that places like LA, Palm Springs, and Miami become very prominent vacation spots. People love the idea of being able to be in the sun 24/7, have nice weather. It's not a decaying, gritty inner city. Right, we get the Googie style in California with Paul Revere Williams begin to develop as well. And all of this becomes synonymous with the new American dream, the era of the automobile, the era of having your own, suburban house with a white picket fence. And so Las Vegas begins to try to mold itself to become this instead. At this point, they start calling themselves Paradise, so that they can have a protected entity away from the city of Las Vegas. And so you can see it pretty much encompasses the entirety of the strip. So if you've ever heard of Paradise, which is where we are right now, that's where it comes from the casinos not wanting to pay taxes and trying to do their own thing. Now it is also at this point that we have the introduction of the mob, which is where things start to get a little bit messy. So this is Murder Incorporated, that was actually their name. Murder Incorporated was a mob group from New York City who began spreading all throughout the US. They did a number of different things. Each one of them had a specialty of sorts. So we have Bugsy right here, the most famous mobster for Las Vegas. Bugsy was known for murdering people and I think torturing people. That was his specialty of sorts. And they had a lot of casinos at this point. So because their original trade was during the Prohibition era, right, they were moonshiners, once they repealed that and they made it legal to drink again, they had to find a new business for themselves. And so they started spreading out across the US, and because of this whole migration to the Sun Belt, they started opening resorts in Cuba, Miami, New Orleans. They really started profiting off of all this population influx. And they soon realized that Las Vegas had a very similar demographics and they wanted to come down here as well. So the two members that are going to be influential in Vegas are going to be Meyer Lansky. He's kind of like the boss of Murder Incorporated. And then we have Bugsy Siegel, who is of course the actual hitman of Murder Incorporated. Now at this time, we do have famous movie star Billy Wilkerson, who decides he also wants to open a casino in Las Vegas. Unfortunately, he's also a professional gambler, so in trying to create a trap for people as they come into the city, he ends up trapping himself, and he kind of goes broke before he can actually finish the construction. And so he needs someone to start backing him up and giving him a little bit of money to finish that construction. He finds someone, but what he doesn't know is that that someone is tied to the mob. And this is usually how the mob gets into the casinos. They have ghosts that go around lending money, and then that ghost is in debt to the mob, and then the mob comes in and cashes in on the casino. So the Flamingo was going to be located down here, or is located down here. You can see even further south. And his idea was he didn't just want it to be the furthest south casino, he also wanted it to be the only one that you could see within that radius. And though it looks kind of close today, keep in mind that these were very low and broad buildings. So you couldn't really see it that well, and they were self-contained. So if you were in the pool, you couldn't really see out anywhere else. And so Wilkerson got to around this point where, we still have a lot of construction, but you can see it's this big opening that has the resort and the pool area in the center here. And what he did, that was a bit of an innovation that again ended up costing him his own casino, was he placed the casino right where you enter. So prior to this, the casino was usually a small little piece somewhere in the back where you went to go gamble if you wanted to. But now he placed it right in your face so that you would be more inclined to do so before you checked into your hotel. And this is what started the era that we call the Mousetrap Casino. There they are completing the construction. At this point, Meyer Lansky, who owns the Flamingo, decides to leave Bugsy Siegel in charge of it. But remember, Bugsy doesn't really specialize in construction, so he makes a lot of mistakes. All right, there's the grand opening. Announce it. Unfortunately, it does not go very well for a number of reasons. So first of all, he hires Virginia Hill, who is his girlfriend, to become the new interior designer. She's not an interior designer, and he also fires the architect, so that doesn't go too well for him. Secondly, he doesn't know the first thing about plumbing, and so rather than running one plumbing line that just kind of branches out into the different rooms, he creates an entirely separate plumbing line from the water source out into each room, and an entirely separate sewage line as well. So you can imagine that was a lot more pipe than they accounted for. He also imported flamingos because of the name flamingo, and because it's too hot out here, they started dying. So you had a bunch of dead flamingos as people were coming in. He also did not know the structural efficiency of concrete, and so years later, when they were bulldozing the Bugsy addition, it took 3 days of wrecking it with a wrecking ball for the wall to finally come down. He balloons the actual budget from $1 million to $6 million, and lastly, the AC did not work on opening day. So it was a total catastrophe. It did not go well, and you can imagine the mob was not happy with him because of the fact that he overspent $5 million on things that could have easily been avoided. Eventually, he got it back on its feet. It became quite profitable, and it became the luxurious of the three. People wanted to come here if they had any type of money. He did have a strict dress code, though, which some people didn't like. But But you can see it was more or less starting to become successful, and we have this idea of the Sunbelt modern era perfectly encapsulated into the Flamingo. Now, unfortunately, because Bugsy did spend a lot, he was murdered in LA. He was not murdered in Las Vegas because there was a thing called the Purity Code, which basically said, because we're a resort town, we're gonna try to keep the reputation clean, so we're not gonna murder anyone in the city, we're gonna wait until they leave the city. It's also part of the reason why we found a lot of people tied up on the bottom of Lake Mead, because technically that was outside the city, so that was acceptable. But once Bugsy left to LA, he was in his mansion and they shot him for overspending on the Flamingo. And so, Bugsy Siegel became the infamous founder of Las Vegas, the father of the Strip, the godfather of Vegas. But now you know the truth. He didn't actually really do much. This was all someone else's idea. He was actually a huge failure of a casino manager. But because the American public is so into the mob and the history of it, they like to attribute it to Bugsy Siegel. So if you go to the Flamingo, there is a little memorial for him there. And there's all sorts of tales of Bugsy Siegel ghosts roaming around the pool and so forth. All right, so the Flamingo begins this new era. Meanwhile, the Last Frontier and the El Rancho are starting to paint their walls hot pink. They're trying to make themselves a gooky frontier now so that they fit into this new thematic. So we're seeing that they're starting this trend of reinventing themselves and picking up on new themes depending on what people want. The Thunderbird is the next one after the Flamingo. You can see that the signage begins to become a little bit more literal, a little bit more three-dimensional at this point. And what the Thunderbird introduces is the idea of a porte cochere right here. Essentially just a covered driveway for people to unload. It becomes a symbol of luxury, and it's something that most casinos pick up on after the fact. Thunderbird tries to mesh the idea of the pioneer Western village with the idea of Sunbelt modern, so that it becomes, what does that say? It's something to be seen at the luxurious Thunderbird Hotel. It's more smart. There we go. So we see they're sort of blending. They're this in-between phase. And there it is with its full porte cochere, quite long, quite popular in the 50s. And the Thunderbird takes on a very similar form to all the other ones, just wings of rooms, and then the central pool complex in the back. Just Flamingo. Oops. Thunderbird was around here as well. Now at this point, we have the introduction of a new monster, right? And his name is Moe Dalitz, and he's going to be based in Cleveland. Now, Moe Dalitz also wants to get in on these profits. He sees that the New York group is doing pretty well. He wants to get in as well. But he decides that he doesn't want all this Bugsy stuff to become his problem as well. And so he decides to partner up with Wilbur Clark. And this is the way that most casinos are going to be run from this point forward. You have a face of the company, and then you have the secret investor who's the actual owner. And so on the front of the Desert Inn, he specifically requests it be called Wilbur Clark's Desert Inn, so that there is no mistaking it. This has nothing to do with the mob. No one in here has any connection to it. And what we see at the Desert Inn is the introduction of the idea of a sky lounge, the luxury of being up higher than everyone else. But also start to notice the themes of the names in the Sunbelt modern era are very much based on sun, desert, heat, warmth. So we'll see a couple more after this. The interior of the Desert Inn also innovates in the sense that whereas Flamingo put the casino in the front, so you came in, checked in, and the casino was right there, Desert Inn put the casino where you come in, and then they put the front desk all the way in the back of the property. So notice we do have windows here that look out into the pool, so that in plan, excuse me, the front desk was all the way back here. You did have to traverse the whole casino floor before you could even check into your room. Up here is going to be the famous Sky Lounge. The pool shape changes a little bit. Now we're doing some more freeform pools in order to fit that gooky style. And once you're up in the Sky Lounge, it is pretty much a cocktail bar. And you can see that the finishes on it are a lot more luxurious. They're a lot more akin to that mid-century feeling than anything related to the Western frontier. So at this point, we fully transitioned out of the Western phase. Now, at the same time, in the 50s, we do have the famous Kefauver Committee that is going around the United States trying to crack down on everything that's going down with the mob, and one of the cities they visit is Las Vegas, and they do come to our courthouse, which is today the Mob Museum. That's the reason it is called so. And start questioning everyone. And what they don't know is that everyone in Las Vegas knows about the mobsters. They know the mobsters, they hang out with them, but they're all covering for them because they know that there's a lot of profit to be made. And so he questions the lieutenant governor, basically like the vice president, but for the governor. And Lieutenant Governor Cliff Jones is asked, do you know Meyer Lansky, aka the guy that owns the Flamingo? And he says, as far as I know, he has never even been in the city of Las Vegas. And they were known to hang out together now. And clearly we know Meyer Lansky was definitely in Vegas. So Lieutenant Governor is also involved in this. Then we have Mo Dalitz, mobster behind the Desert Inn, who's also questioned about his moonshining practices back in the day. And he says, if you people wouldn't have drunk it, I wouldn't have bootlegged it. And the Kefauver Committee can't really do anything about it. So nothing really comes out of it in Las Vegas, at least. The mob is still running most of these casinos, of course, under the guise of someone else. We then get the Sahara. Again, notice the name. Sahara was actually named as a tribute to the World War II soldiers that went to the sub-Saharan region. So now they are trying to appeal to the veterans that came back from the war and give them a place to vacation where they can feel like they are being honored for their service in the military. And one of their ways of doing that is by inviting Marlene Dietrich, who was one of the ladies who would go out to the front and she would dance for the soldiers. She was pretty much sent by the government to incentivize them, right? And you can see she was very much beloved on the front. So now that all these soldiers are back, now that the war has ended, they invite her out to Las Vegas to have a residency, and this attracts a lot of the veterans to come back and watch her. And it's kind of sad, a lot of the accounts talk about them being missing a limb or being missing an eye, being in wheelchairs at this point, but they're just so happy to see her, and you know, she recognizes a handful of them as well. So this is another tactic that casinos start employing, bringing in performers and people that pull on the heartstrings of Americans. Next, we have the Riviera in this same time period, and the Riviera's innovation is really just having a 9-story tower. So prior to this, it was believed that because Las Vegas's ground is mostly caliche, that it was not suitable for high-rise buildings because it would sink. But the Riviera, with its 9 stories, proved that that was false. And so at this point, they can begin building a little bit higher and higher as the eras go on. Riviera is also Sunbelt style. You can see breeze blocks, a little bit of googie going on the interior. And speaking of googie, Paul Revere Williams arrives in the same time period. So the Concha, the Guardian Angel Cathedral, both of these are related to Mo Dalitz, the same guy from the Desert Inn. If you've ever driven on Desert Inn, you'll know it passes underneath the Wynn and then it comes back up this way. So Desert Inn is located where the Encore is today. And Mo Dalitz noticed a lot of his workers were Catholic, so he decided to build them their own church so they wouldn't have to go too far. And he commissions Paul Revere Williams, who at this point is a very notable architect. And he pretty much embodies this idea of the Sunbelt modern. But another project that he does is a whole strip property, which is called the Royal Nevada. Now this one is not very well documented, but what we do know about it is that it had one of the first water shows or fountain shows on the strip. The thematic for the Royal Nevada is a little bit different from the rest of the Sunbelt modern, but the idea was Camelot, the golden age of Camelot, or in this case, the golden age of America. That's at least how they saw themselves, with the 50s being a very prosperous time period. And you can see the idea of the porte cochere has become even larger at this point, since we have more people coming into the property. But on the inside, they have this whole water show going on. And by this point, the groundwater isn't looking too good in Las Vegas. Whereas before, you only had to dig 5 feet, now you do have to dig down 300 feet in order to access any groundwater. And properties like this one don't really help all that much. But they weren't really environmentally conscious at the time. They didn't really understand the impact of what they were doing on the environment. So the merits of this property is really just how it innovated the entertainment aspects. They brought in water, and so we see that the stage is beginning to transform itself. It's not just the stage, it's also a theatrical production. Now, Paul Revere Williams isn't really allowed into the Royal Nevada. He cannot stay there despite designing it, and so he does have to go to the famous Moulin Rouge. Moulin Rouge is going to be in the west side. Unfortunately, it was demolished, so it's no longer around today. But it's still a very important part of our city's history because it was the first desegregated casino in the city. So you didn't just have to be African American to come in here. Anyone was welcome to come in here. To the point where, if you know who the famous Rat Pack is, Sammy Davis Jr. was the African-American member. He could not stay in Desert Inn or in Sands or in any of the resorts that had invited him to perform. He did have to come back to the Moulin Rouge. And so Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra decided that if he couldn't stay there, they wouldn't do so either. And they came with him to Moulin Rouge and they would perform here as well. And so the Moulin Rouge hosted a number of the most spectacular performers because of the fact that they were open to anyone. And we once again see that the stage begins to transform itself as far as how diverse the cast members can be. Now, I won't go into the history of these three, but just notice the names. We have Hacienda, the Sands, the Dunes, all names associated with the heat of the desert, and they all begin to attract a number of people as well. So by this point, I think you can begin to see that there's a saturation in the market for this specific type of resort. And it all ends with the Tropicana. Now, the Tropicana is the most luxurious of them all. You can see that the simplicity of the front of it speaks to the wealth of some of the guests that are visiting. The porte cochere is perfectly illuminated from above. It's a very simple casino. And what they do on the inside, the owner, I'll show you who the real owner is in a second. The owner, Phil Dandy Castile, says if a man wants to gamble, he's gonna gamble. But there's no point putting a rope around his neck and saying, here, gamble. So what he means by that is, architecturally, you do not need to have people weaving through all these slot machines or these gambling tables in order to get to the front desk. You can perfectly well have what he calls peacock alleys, which in modern casinos would look like this. And you can walk through the entirety of the resort. And yes, you're walking along the casino floor itself, but you're not meandering through the machines. And so that's why peacock alleys became quite prominent as well, because children can stop on them. If you guys were ever kids on the Strip, you'll know that you weren't allowed to stop on the carpet. You did have to stop somewhere on the peacock alley where it wasn't technically the casino floor. And so he adds a little bit of class and elegance into the Tropicana because of that, because the gambling is not right in your face. Now, the real owner of the Tropicana, Frank Costello, also a part of the New York mob, separate branch, ends up being murdered in his New York apartment. And what they find in his apartment when they walk in is a little note that says, casino earnings to date, $651,000, which happens to be the exact amount that the Tropicana has reported as part of its income or profits. So we know by this point that Frank Costello and a whole bunch of the mobsters are definitely, as a matter of fact, involved in Las Vegas, and the business is starting to look a little dirty, right? Bugsy Siegel was a fun coincidence that people tended to sensationalize, but by this point they're starting to realize that this is a pretty dirty business, and so the Sunbelt modern era begins to end around this time. But what we can take from it is the same thing that's going on in the larger United States. As the Fremont Street experience, or the inner city experience in the rest of America begins to become one of decay, we see that the suburbs begin to pop off and invite people with their nice broad lawns. They're open, they're meant for the automobile and not the pedestrian. And so the Strip is very much reflecting that same trend, because ultimately the Strip is the original suburb of the city of Las Vegas. And the three things we can learn from the Sunbelt era are, number one, the idea of a casino as a fly or a mouse trap. So a lot of them would think about their casinos as penis fly traps, where once you get them to gamble once, you can get them to keep doing it over and over again to make money off of them. Number two, we learned how ephemeral thematic design can be, and we see that with The Last Frontier, we see that with the El Rancho, who are just starting to try to change their appearance because it changed so quickly, or the idea of what Americans want to change so quickly. And lastly, we also see the idea of keeping the mob as a ghost entity and the importance of that if we want to keep a clean reputation in the city. So in this next era that we're going to look at, mob is still there, they're just not going to be as upfront about it in order to start cleaning up the reputation more or less. But by this point, they're starting to see it as a not so great place to be. Now, for the next 10 years, another relatively short era, we're going to get what we call the pop city age. Pop city meaning popular culture. So in the 60s, we have the civil rights movement, the cultural revolution, the sex revolution. The middle class is the biggest demographic in the United States, and the pop culture that appeals to them is exactly what Las Vegas wants to bring in order to bring in the middle class. So I couldn't find a graph that went as far back as the 40s and 50s. I don't think they really took those statistics back then, but I did find one from the 70s, which is around the time that the pop city era ends. And you can see that the middle class is by far the largest demographic, and Vegas starts trying to cash in on that. We also see that the availability of automobiles is skyrocketing. So at the beginning of the pop city era, we're right here, and then by the end of it, we're up here. So we've almost doubled the amount of cars that Americans own, meaning that it's now a whole lot easier for more people to access Las Vegas, and specifically access the Strip, which is meant for the automobile. So I'm going to start talking about the Stardust, just to give you an idea of how this era changes the architecture of the Strip. So hopefully you can see the largest change is, of course, the explosion of neon itself. Neon has come to be associated with that middle class, with the mid-century feeling. But the Stardust in particular was conceived as a cheap hotel. It was not meant to bring in those high rollers, because at this point, we've oversaturated the market with the Tropicana and the Flamingo and the Desert Inn, who are all trying to get those high rollers. The creator of the Stardust says, I'm going to try to get those middle ground people, the low ballers. We also have the space race happening in the 60s, and so this is the first example of them looking at pop culture and going, what are people into right now? Let's just make a casino that's themed around that. And that's where we get the famous Stardust from. But the architecture of the Stardust is quite different from that of the Tropicana and that of the Flamingo, in that it's not this big open casino with arms and a nice pool in the center. It's a bunch of utilitarian sheds on a sea of asphalt. It is very much a middle-class resort, where the whole appeal of it is that you can go and gamble. Las Vegas at this point is the only city in America that has legalized gambling, so they do hold a monopoly on it. And you can see that the architecture of it up front is also not very impressive. At this point, they've also perfected the idea of the mousetrap, and they've started removing any windows from the casino floor so that you'll forget about the passage of time. There's the big sign on the front, an early version of it. And then we can see how the sign now becomes the facade, whereas before it was placed, as a little fin on the facade or a separate entity altogether. Now we are seeing that neon is literally becoming the architecture of this era. And so there's literally rooms of people back here. People are sleeping behind this neon, which is just buzzing, because it's that old, crappy neon. It's just buzzing and, having little explosions here and there, and they can't fall asleep, which is part of the whole mousetrap, where if they can't sleep, they're just going to go, fuck it, I'm going to go and gamble some more. And it worked. It was a very profitable casino. Now, around this time, we see Fremont starts realizing, hey, if Stardust worked and they're bringing in, middle-class people or, the lower-class people, we're already seen as like the lower-class Vegas anyways. Why don't we try to profit off of that too? And so they also start bringing in their own form of neon. But what we see is that the neon on Fremont Street is much more three-dimensional, because Fremont Street is experienced as a pedestrian. Since it's such a small street, the sidewalk is literally right there. You don't want this to just be a flat facade. You want it to fully envelop the person so that it is a whole experience as they walk through the street. Right, so we're getting taller pieces, more volumetric pieces, more colorful pieces, and eventually you can't even see the building behind it. So that the whole building is just covered in neon. Neon is the facade at this time period. And you can see the appeal of the curvature. Some of them have them being bulbous in the opposite direction. We start calling them bull-nosed neons. There you see the Golden Nugget is having the opposite type of curvature. And by the way, if you chose the mint, this is called the famous eyebrow motif. Right, and then we also have these shaded areas that are also filled with neon. So everything about this is just, boom, overstimulating to the pedestrian. And so as you're walking down here, you're no longer seeing, the buildings in the distance. You're seeing all these signs in your face, boom, 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 boom. And that is what Denise Scott Brown and Robert Vintori talk about. The decorated shed and the era of the sign, the era of the automobile, being able to read these from afar, but also having the volumetric neon bring you in if you're close by. There's the eyebrow, and so forth. So they're all trying to compete with each other. So we see that in Las Vegas, competition is not based, or rather, innovation is not based on building codes or the city trying to push us to do something new. It is based on competition. If your competitor is doing it, you want to do it as well, but you want to do it bigger and better. Now, unfortunately, this neon at the time is not LEDs, so it is going to get super, super, super hot, so that the experience at the time, if you're walking down Fremont Street, is going to be like being in a little toaster, right? If you're walking in the center, you will feel the heat radiating off of both sides of the street, and it starts also creating an urban heat island effect. It doesn't really cool down at night anymore because that's when the lights come on. But the other downside to all this is that environmentally, we can't really keep up with the energy to power all of this neon. We also have AC at this time begin to be incorporated into those older properties. Because the neon is so hot, we have to pump in even more electricity in order to cool it. And in order to bring in people, you'll notice that a lot of the older properties do keep their doors completely open. There usually aren't any doors, so that the air kind of hits you and it kind of lures you into a nice cool spot to gamble even more, get a nice drink. And so we see a lot of energy going to waste. And unfortunately, Hoover Dam cannot keep up. Our energy consumption is 300% more per capita than the average American city. But the reason why we spend so much is because it's half as cheap as anywhere else. So we have this, paradox, and we don't really quite know what to do, but we know we need more energy. And so we find an alternative that's really quite dirty, and we start burning coal up near Moapa. So if you see this when you drive up north, that's what it is. That is how we started generating more energy to power all this neon and the AC of the city. But unfortunately, in order to bring in water to cool the system, you have to be located near a water source. So they locate near the Muddy and Virgin Rivers up north where the Mormons came through. And ash ponds start contaminating our groundwater in that area. So now, not only is our groundwater really scarce, it's also becoming polluted. And we don't really quite know that yet. The other after effect of this is we start developing higher rates of lung cancer and asthma near Moapa. So a lot of the natives start experiencing breathing issues because of the fumes coming off from the coal burning plant. But this is so far away that Las Vegas is truly alienated from the huge environmental impact that it's starting to have. And as Fremont Street is starting to develop its neon to become bigger, better, and become the focal point of the casino, the strip begins to follow. And so this is the strip of the 1960s, where we don't necessarily see the architecture anymore. We don't see any low-rise, we simply see signs everywhere. It is the era of automobile. And in an automobile, you drive quite quickly, so you need to have something big, flashy, with huge letters that you can be able to read if you're zooming past at 40 miles per hour. So notice that all the buildings back here are, for the most part, very low. And so we see that the sign and the building sort of switch positions, where now the main part of the hierarchy is the signage itself. And we see this quote from the time. The owner of the Dunes said that the Humboldt globe, as in the light globe, is to Las Vegas what the humble brick is to a more conventional townscape. He calls it a basic unit for building monuments. So neon is the most basic unit of Las Vegas at this time. And so in a normal city, we would have a project hierarchy where the architect is at the top, then we have our interior designers, and lastly, if you have one, you might have your sign designer. But Las Vegas, as always, tries to flip architecture on its head, and the sign designer becomes the single most important designer on that whole property. They host entire competitions, not for the architecture of the building, but for what that sign is going to look like. The interior designer is the second most important because they bring in the themes, they envelop people and give them that experience. And at the very tail end is the architect, because you need a warehouse to house all of this in. Architects try to fight back and they try to create deeper motifs, right? They're trying to do Bauhaus, form follows function, but people don't want to care about it, and so they just kind of plaster signs all over it. Now in the 60s, we also have the sex revolution, which is basically when the US stops being so prudish and starts openly accepting nudity a little bit more. Promiscuity isn't seen as badly as it was in the 50s. And we also have, at the same time, truckers begin to increase because now the interstate system has taken off, railroads have been replaced by highways. We have a lot of truckers coming into Las Vegas, so we have a lot of single men. And so that mixed with the sex revolution equals having these types of shows begin to pop up on the Strip. And so the Strip starts to become the sexy area of the United States in the 60s. So we have the famous Minsky Follies from the Dunes, and you can see that they start traveling all throughout the United States, and they are now being marketed as being directly from Las Vegas. So Las Vegas now has this reputation of being a city that sells sex. This is at the Tropicana. We even have a video for this one. So they're not quite as promiscuous as we might think. Right, but we do get the invention of the showgirl at this time, and the idea of creating nude illusions and rhinestones on the skin, right, peeking under the skirt, all of these become popular motifs in Las Vegas. And so because of this, now we have to start evolving our stages. How can our stages host as many girls as possible and have all these cool movements? How can we have them be a little bit higher than the audience so you can peek under their skirts a little bit better? Right, how can we have these pieces that move on the stage itself? So the showgirls, in many ways, also start driving the innovation of our stages. We want to give our viewers a different experience from the hotel down the road. So that gives you a little peek of what that was like. Now, creepily, at the Hacienda, we have the same concept, but with puppet dolls. So people went to go watch Puppet Strip at the Hacienda at the time. But at the Stardust, right, the one that started this whole era, we see that they're pushing the idea of the stage where it's not just up front, the whole theater becomes the stage, and they have these, floating pieces that come out from the top of the ceiling with more showgirls, and so now the audience is fully immersed in the experience. And if you've ever been to a Cirque du Soleil show, they get a lot of their inspiration from this time period where these start becoming the norm in the show business. Now, because of all this, right, we have the masses. There is this idea we gotta attract the masses and not the classes, but not everyone thinks that way. So in the Dunes, the owner starts saying, we have to get rid of all these bums, by which he meant the truckers. And his friends were like, but the truckers have made you your fortune and they're your friends. And he's like, I don't care. We have to get these bums out and we have to get the mink coats back in here. So he's trying to make it a lot classier again. And so he starts creating more thematic experiences that are akin to where Americans want to vacation. Remember that this is the pop city era, so we're looking at what popular culture wants. And popular culture wants to vacation to places like Hawaii, they want to go places like Mexico, they want to be out in the tropics. And now our dining experiences take a note from our stages and start becoming a whole dinner with a show experiences. This one is pretty impressive. It's called the Dome of the Sea. So this is in reference to the deep sea explorations that were also going on in the 1960s. People were fascinated with what we could find down there. And so they create this so it looks like you're under the sea. We have harpists. And notice that this is a little bit more classy than perhaps what we just saw with all the puppet showgirls. So we're seeing that we're once again starting to shift the demographics a little bit. Here's a couple more pop culture references. We have the Silver Slipper, of course a reference to Cinderella, but they weren't going to call it that because of copyright. And we have the Aladdin, not in reference to the movie because that's from the 90s, but in reference to Hollywood's fascination with the Middle East and Egypt and portraying exotic women at the time. And so the Aladdin opens up as a response to that. And if you really look at every casino from the 60s, it has to do with something that Americans were into at the time. But the two most famous properties and the most influential ones from the 60s are going to be by Jay Sarno. Because Jay Sarno revolutionizes what it means to have a theme. It's not just something you apply to the surfaces, it is something that you have your employees do, it is something that envelops every single experience. And compared to the Stardust, which had a cosmic feeling, and then it had a tiki bar, and then it had some Western things somewhere else, both of these properties have the same theme throughout the entirety of the resort. So we're going to start by talking about Caesars. Caesars is the higher class version to the Circus Circus. So Jay Sarno also wants to start getting some of those high rollers. And you'll notice that the way in which the building is positioned is much further back from the Strip. So he starts this idea of creating a procession from the Strip, which many people told him it's going to be a failure, people are not going to come, it's too far away. But by placing the fountains up front and giving it this more regal entryway with the porte cochere, it actually works out pretty well. And people pay extra just to stay at the Caesars. We also see he introduces curvature into the architecture because he famously believed that when you have curves, you make the gambler feel a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more at home, and so they'll stay for longer. And he's not wrong. I went to the Caesars on Sunday as part of a field exploration for this class, and the gambling floor inside this oval right here was packed. You couldn't walk through it. He also starts introducing, outside of that oval, higher ceilings as well. So this is a part of the older Caesars property back here where you see the black ceiling. And notice how much taller that is than the claustrophobic Flamingo or even the Tropicana from the prior era. Because he knows that by having higher ceilings, you give the gambler somewhere to look up to, a little bit of a breath away from the machine. So you have to create a restorative environment so that they don't get oversaturated too quickly. They can look away at something else, they can look at a statue perhaps, and then come back to the machine and keep spending more money. So we're really starting to get into the psychology of the gambler at this point. And the workers, the waitresses, everyone who was at the casino had to play into this idea that everyone who was at Caesar's Palace was a Caesar. So you'll notice that Caesar's Palace does not have an apostrophe, it is plural. Everyone there can be a Caesar. The everyday man, the trucker, anyone that's willing to pay the premium price can have someone say to them, I am your slave, how may I serve you? AKA, what kind of drink do you want? And then they would always have to answer by saying, yes, master. So we start seeing that we have this concept of cast members to fully immerse people in the idea of themselves being a part of the thematics. The fountains up front do have cypresses on each side, which are not native to Vegas. They cannot really survive in our heat, so they do have to replace them every couple months. Jay Sarno said, I am not going to put palm trees because those weren't in ancient Rome. I need to have cypress trees, so that's what we're going to do. So once again, there isn't really a consideration for the environment. One of the cool things that does happen on the fountain is because it is so big and it is such a sensation everywhere, we do have the famous Evel Knievel, who's a daredevil trying to do the jump with his motorcycle. Unfortunately, it didn't really end so well. So you'll see what happens at the end, but he ends in a 9-month-long coma. But you can see there's lots of people gathered at this point. It becomes a marketing tactic to bring people in to see these, intense shows and have all these emotions in Las Vegas. Vegas becomes the crazy part of the United States. But he does suffer that fall at the end, and you can see it falls on his head. So he does go into a coma after this. Evel Knievel is famous for breaking every single bone in his body at least once, if not twice or 3 times. So if you've ever been to the East Fremont experience, there's this great place called Evel Pie, E-V-E-L Pie. It sells pizza, and it's based around Evel Knievel. We're also going to get a museum on Evel Knievel, I think, in a couple of years. Anyways, events like these are what become synonymous with Las Vegas. You can get all the thrills for cheap. At the buffet, you are served by people who are also dressed up as cast members. And then, a not so great part was, we do have piranhas in here. So the idea is you could feed your food to the piranhas, right? But Jay Sarno is so into, being a Roman and everything that comes with that, which, if you recall, what they did in the Colosseum wasn't so nice. So he brings in baby piglets, and he wants to throw them to be eaten alive by the piranhas as part of the spectacle. Unfortunately, our health department stops him, and that never happens, thankfully. But you can see he's a crazy man. He has all these ideas, and it works, it works in part. He goes a little too far sometimes. So these are some of the other experiences he has to offer his guests, and notice that all of them are Roman themed. They are not historically accurate Roman, they are what Americans believe the Romans did. And that's why we call it the Pop City era. It's what the popular imagination wants to believe it is. To create a sister hotel, or not hotel, a property to that, he creates the Circus Circus, which was geared to a lower class, but it was just as immersive. Now you'll notice Circus Circus doesn't have a hotel attached to it, which ultimately didn't help its case. It simply is a circus tent where you can go gamble and get a really crazy experience. So if you've gone to the Circus Circus today, or if you have it as the building you're looking at, when you come in, you'll notice that the gambling floor is incredibly low. It's like 7 feet. And that's because that floor was not originally there. It was actually fully open to the ceiling so that as you're gambling down here, you will have acrobats and the whole circus going on up there. So this is what it originally looked like, but they realized that this was too overstimulating for the gaming industry. Because the people down here weren't so worried about their game, they weren't playing as well as they could have. They were focused on what was going on up here. And so the hotel, or the Circus Circus experience, was kind of competing with itself for the person's attention. They also had things like this, the Ding-a-ling-a-ring bar, which essentially the girls would get on the bar itself so that the people that sat underneath could kind of look up their skirts. So it was kind of like a naughty circus theme at the time. It was not meant for kids. And we also have animals being brought in, so it truly is a circus experience. So you can gamble next to bears and orangutans, and we have a elephant plays bingo, excuse me. The elephant also at some point would do like high wire, but then he would shit down on the gamblers. So that didn't work out, they had to retire it. But again, it goes to show Jay Sarno's genius in creating an immersive experience, and at the same time it shows how it backfired. It simply ended up being too much, and without a hotel tower to funnel in people to constantly be gaming, you just didn't have enough revenue to support the Circus Circus. But it stayed around, we still have it today. As much as people hate it or think it should go, I think it's a pretty cool property still. You'll also notice if you go to a field visit, as you go up the twisty stair, you'll notice that the railing feels a lot lower because it's made with different building code standards than we have today. Now, because Las Vegas is so quickly changing and the screen and the neon become the new architecture, Archigram and other architectural thinkers get inspired by this. They create the famous Instant City collage because that's what Vegas is to them. It's an instant city. You come back one year, it's one thing, and then you come back the next year, it's a whole different experience. And Robert Ventura and Denise Scott Brown, when they visit, praise Las Vegas. People think they're going to hate it because of the fact that the architect is at the bottom of this hierarchy, but they believe that the architect has so much to learn from this to humble them, so that they stop thinking that architecture is above everything else, and they start listening to what the American people actually want their buildings to look like. And so they say, modern architects, think they're making all these amazing ducks, but all they're doing is making fake warehouses, fake industrial buildings, because you can't tell a hospital apart from an office building or apart from a bank. They all just look modernist, and they don't like that. They want to break away from that, and they celebrate the fact that Las Vegas is a decorated shed, and you can easily take down the front of it and do something new whenever the public, the American public, is feeling like they want to do something new. And so in the Pop City age, we learned 3 more things. Number 1, we figure out that we don't always have to appeal to the elite, and that there is definitely a market there for the middle class, and that we don't have to make ourselves always look classy, you know? And this is where we get that classic trashy feeling of Las Vegas. Number 2, we see that the sign and not the building becomes the iconic form. And lastly, we see that now thematics are not just a matter of applying it on the surface, but they're also a complete experience that the visitor themselves can play into. Does anyone have any questions on the lecture or on the collage? Anything related to the class? All right, as I announced, you do have the ability to visit the special collections where you will find rare photographs. That will make it so much more easier for you to collage. And secondly, the place where we do host the gallery and architectural services is offering to help you guys put together your collages, to give you ideas, feedback, to help you improve your manifestos as well. Anytime in these next 2 to 3 weeks, after 5 p.m. So if you want to stop by the art square at that time, they'll be available to give you guys some ideas. And they do collage a lot of their projects, so they are experts in the matter. All right, I'll see you guys on